All right, thanks Diego for having me over. I'm really excited to get a little tour of your place and see all these experiments you got going on.
Sure.
Could you tell us a little bit more about you and all the amazing work that you've been doing, I don't know, probably at least the last 10 years in the regenerative farming movement?
Sure, yeah. Welcome to my garden. I'm Diego. I host a podcast. I have a YouTube channel. I've been doing a lot of work over the past 10 years in permaculture, small-scale agriculture, small-scale livestock, really all over the board. This is my home site where I'm kind of going for real gardening and just trying out some of the things I've learned, trying to advance some ideas. This is not a productive market garden setting, but where I'm more hobby, fun, and exploring some curiosities that I have around growing.
Awesome, and that's what I really wanted to talk to you about today, because you're really into biochar also, and that's something that I've been experimenting with a little bit myself too the last couple of years, and you've gone a lot further with it, and you've used it extensively out here, so I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, biochar is something that I've been interested in since day one. I can't tell you where I discovered it. It was probably through some sort of Terra Preta article or video going back 8-9 years ago now. Along the way, I met Peter Hurst. He presented at one of the conferences I did. He was at the time with New England Biochar. I think he's now out here in California. He presented at one of the conferences. I got really stoked about biochar, and I've always tried to incorporate that into my beds. These are the original beds that I had in production here since I moved in. I used to have this rotational chicken system, and I would try as much as I could produce biochar every time I would turn a bed and go from one that had chickens in it to then putting cover crops in it. My process was, okay, chickens grazed it down, came in, added biochar into the soil, topped it with compost, planted a cover crop, let the chickens come back later when the cover crop had grown, and just repeated. And one thing I did notice over time is like that soil got really black, and that was always cool to me because the chickens would dig down and you see this rich black soil. I don't know that that was all from the biochar, because you need to add quite a bit of biochar to change the albedo of the soil, the color of the soil. But that's really how I got started, and I really started producing it on a home scale using basic things like a wash drum to do the burning. Maybe not the most technical way to produce biochar, but it was a way to produce biochar nonetheless, using tree prunings that I had here on the property, wood that, you know, people give away around me locally, old scrap, construction lumber, all those types of things. And I'm just a believer in it. We'll start with what is biochar, and really we can remove the bio part of it first, and let's start on just char, because really all it is charcoal, the carbon that remains after wood has been burned in an area absent of oxygen. So if you burn wood without oxygen, you burn off the wood gas, you're left with the carbon, and this takes place in a process called pyrolysis. If you just burn a simple wooden match, there's a little bit of pyrolysis occurring at the tip of the match right below the flame. So char becomes biochar when you add biology to the char. So we could call this biochar, even though I haven't added biology to it, or we could call it char or charcoal. They're interchangeable terms, they're all the same thing. This is just a piece of pallet wood that remains after a biochar burn in its solid form. You could add this to the soil as is. It's chunky, it would break down over time as you walk on it, as you put a shovel through it. You know, plant roots are probably going to separate this some. If you're doing tillage, well, that's obviously going to break this up. Or there's a more powderized version which you can make using various methods, where we literally get a real powdery fine form, which you could put into maybe an irrigation line. You could soil drench it through a watering can. You could add it to your compost. You could add it to your potting mix. You could sprinkle this over the soil. But biochar, regardless of what form it's in, powder or whole, is really just charcoal. The bio, again, comes in when you activate it. How you activate it, there's a lot of different ways to do that. Some people would run the char through a compost pile, letting the microbes from the compost pile get into the char, because what you have here is a immense amount of surface area. This is like, Stephen, you were explaining earlier, is a coral reef, or think of it like a sponge on a microscopic level. If you were to zoom in on this, it would look very porous. And the idea here is you now have this microbe hotel, or an immense amount of surface area for cation exchange to take place. Different nutrients could be attracted to the char, and plants could come to the char to exchange those nutrients within the soil. So that's the amazing thing about biochar. If you were to measure the surface area on this outer brick of char, there's not that much relative, but when you start considering all the porous area, I don't know the exact number, but there might be 1,000 times more surface area in those pores than there is on the simple surface. And when you powderize it, you more or less infinitely increase the surface area of the char itself. So by adding the biology to it before you put it in the soil, they start to fill that surface area. You could do that through the compost pile. You could do that through Korean natural farming, make your own microbial mix, an EM type formulation, an LAB type formulation. You could soak it in compost tea. I like to keep it simple. I don't like to add this to the soil wet. So usually the way I add it is I just put it onto the soil, and then I say, okay, fine, that's not going to do any work maybe instantly, but eventually the bacteria and the soil organisms will colonize it in the soil, and I'm okay if that steals some nutrients in the meantime. I don't feel like I'm too nutrient deficient to start with. One other thing I really like about biochar is that capacity that it has, the volume in it, the pore spaces, that can also hold water. And out here in California, I mean, it doesn't rain that much. We've gotten about 8 inches of rain here since November, which this is our rainy season. That's not as much as I would have liked to have seen. But when you put those porous sponges into the soil, it's just another thing to help soak up water. I've seen people, and if you look on YouTube, they've done experiments like this where you have a jar full of biochar, and you could essentially empty this jar out, have another mason jar full of water, and you pour the water in, and there's no overflow. Like the char absorbs all of it. So imagine you now have the char and the water occupying the same space as just the water. The amount of absorption that biochar can have is pretty remarkable. So that's another benefit that you're adding to the soil. That's why there's been a lot of research using this in even conventional ag in the Midwest, where they're trying to tie up nutrients in the soils, eliminate leaching, get these soils to maybe instead not hold more water, but increase the organic matter in them and the pore space in them, so they can breathe a little bit more, and they're not just these clay soils that tighten up.
So yeah, there's just so many uses for biochar, and I think it's an input that I think a lot of us will start using more and more into the future.
So when it comes to biochar, there's a lot of ways to make it. You know, if you're going to have a garden, you're going to need really a high volume of biochar, because it can go pretty quickly if you're trying to get aggressive in terms of how much you're putting into the soil. When you make it, you can get really scientific about it, you can get really technical about it. There's a lot of expensive equipment to make it, but there are simple ways to make it. You can make it using a part of an oil drum, you can make it using an old wash tub, you can make it using a metal galvanized steel bucket, you can dig a pit in the ground. The thing I want to encourage people to do is, if you're at all interested in biochar, don't worry about the minutia of, well, is it hot enough? Is there smoke? Is this the exact perfect design of my kiln to make it? Get started making it, get practice, see if you like doing it, and then look to maybe upgrade your equipment. I'm actually looking into producing some biochar kilns that people can use on a home scale, but I don't want the idea of, well, I don't have the right kiln or the perfect kiln to hold people back. Find something that works for you, and like I said, it can be as simple as just a pit in the ground. Get started, get it into your garden, and see if it's right for you. And hopefully it is.
So if you'd like to learn more about biochar, Diego's actually going to be starting up a podcast specifically on biochar, interviewing a lot of different experts, talking about the science behind biochar as well. Could you tell us what that's going to be about?
Sure. So one thing I'm a user of biochar. I'm a believer in biochar, but I think a lot of times, like many things in gardening, belief only gets you so far. Like, I think this helps my soil. I think it works. So I want to test some of those beliefs and talk to some people that have done a lot of research at the university level, talk to a lot of biochar experts, people that have a lot of different experience within the field of biochar, and really get down to, what is it doing? Why is it working? How beneficial is it? Because you can make this on a home scale fairly easily, fairly cheaply. It's going to take some time, but is that time trade-off worth it? Now, for me, I like having the fire with my kids. It's a hobby, it's an experience. If it does anything for the soil, it's almost like, great. I'm sequestering carbon. Like, this carbon, once it goes into the soil, is never going up into the air again. It's just gonna sit here in this soil till it's eroded away some, thousands of years in the future. But I wanted to explore, if you are in a market garden sense, should you spend money buying biochar? If you're on a farm, should you spend money buying equipment to make biochar? Should you, if you're busy, should you allocate time to make biochar? Are you going to see better yields? Maybe because you need them to make a living, maybe because you just want to see them, because who doesn't like a giant pumpkin? So I'm going to be exploring that on a brand new podcast series that will take place every week, where I talk to a new person on biochar. You can learn more about that in the description for this video.